On behalf of the India International Center, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this webcast program, a conversation on intellectual space. I am Suhas Borker, and with me are Ashis Nandy and Ashok Vajpeyi. We are all in the IIC studios, and this is the first time that an in-house webcast is being done from IIC with a single camera, which is fixed and auto, and 3 panelists in the same frame. These are, of course, innovative ways to reach out to you all across these tough COVID times. Thanks to Tete, our Chief of Programs, for putting up all this together, including the Rajasthani handloom spread in front of us. Interestingly, we all three, Ashis Da, Ashok Ji, and myself, are presently elected members representing individual members of the IIC. Ashis Da is elected to the Board of Trustees, and Ashok Ji and myself are elected to the Executive Committee. So today in conversation, we are going to talk of intellectual space, both at the micro level and the macro level. Micro level is the center, we mean the IIC, and macro level is India, Bharat, our country. IIC is reaching a landmark next year, 2022. We are turning 60 years. The IIC Diamond Jubilee Organizing Committee met last week. And by the way, we all three are members of the organizing committee and participated in the deliberations. A lot of interesting points came up in regard to what we call ourselves. IIC is not a club, but an intellectual hub. More on that later. We even discussed at this meeting how the art of civilized discourse has been virtually given a go-by in the country. We are also commemorating 75 years of our independence from the colonial yoke next year. In the context of our conversation, there is this strong public perception today that we are having an undeclared emergency in the country and that the media is under siege. Fake news and troll factories and assembly lines of globalistician tweets and violent threats subverting democratic processes. TV studios have become courts, anchors have become judges, primetime debates are hearings, a false narrative is let loose, information is suppressed. Anyways, the Prime Minister gives no interviews. No one can ask any questions. Dissent and criticism is curbed. Now there is no question hour in Parliament. Federalism is under severe threat. In this scenario, where does the intellectual stand? Is our fragile democracy itself under threat? So I would like Ashis and Ashok Ji to join the conversation. I've given the small intro. The de-intellectualization of the country is taking place. Do you think so? Ratish wrote
that part of the story because I think intellectuals try him to model their voice. Intellectuals thrive when there is attempt to censor. And the more you try that, more intellectual space, as we call it, gets defined only by the intellectual, increasingly so. Everything said, even those who change history dramatically, various ways, from Gandhi to Modi, everything said, their attempt is always get multiple views on a subject, and they look to the intellectual space to have that range of view. They are not angling for hearing only one voice or one proposition or one hypothesis or one project. And a country which has this debate, this kind of a debate, country where constantly different views contesting with each other, a country where the intellectual space is created. Singapore has many things. Singapore has many things. Prosperity, discipline, timelessness has one thing which it requires the most to be a proper, respectable city-state is a wide enough intellectual space. And I would suspect that you cannot push India into a situation where the intellectual space is defined according to the whims of a bureaucracy or the police or politicians. And I would think that in this group, we can concentrate a little bit on the kind of openings which were created within the intellectual space during the emergency. Because I think, I am convinced, not a matter of only thinking, it's my conviction, that that was the time we grew up as a mature democracy. And the kind of flourishing market that opened up for journals, newspapers, and events or experimental writings at the time lasted has quite a while. It is only now again that there is that a dearth of that kind of open debate. Intellectual issues. And intellectuals are right to discuss any subject.
I was just taking the cue from you. The intellectual space seemed to have shrunken in the main print media, in English and also in Hindi. Not so in regional languages. One. Two, even in Hindi, intellectual space now exists in literary journals and small magazines, where there's a large number of them coming, and where these issues of violence, of police atrocities, of rape figures going up, and all these things that we are talking about. So when we talk of intellectual space, we should not confine it to the English-speaking intellectual space. There's a lot of intellectual space which is being nourished, sustained, and expanded through innovative ways, as you said, was done during the emergency. Similar kind of things are taking place in small groups in universities and things of that kind. The difference seems to be that as yet, I think, it is possible to create that kind of intellectual space. It is possible to do so. It may not be easy as the years go by, as the regimes working seem to suggest. It may not be so easy soon. One. Second thing is that India's plurality is something which just cannot be suppressed. It's a civilization which has lived through plurality, openness, accommodation, dialogue, dissent, etc. 3,000, 4,000 years. So how in a small time frame, whatever may be your support of the bureaucracy, and sometimes even judiciary seems to be falling a prey, and the police, you cannot. There is something like a genetic plurality in India.
Yes.
In fact, I'm fond of saying that nothing is allowed in India to be singular. Whether God, language, religion, cuisine, custom, you have. You cannot have singularity. And that singularity, whoever may try it, and the more you try to be, there was a time when Anantmurti used to say something very interesting. He used to talk about the unity diversity paradigm. He said the moment you start insisting on unity, you will discover diversity. The moment you start pushing diversity, you will discover unity. Now, for our purposes, if we change the terms and we say the moment you start pushing singularity, plurality would emerge. And the moment you start pushing plurality, equality will emerge. In spite of the
Shiv Vishwanathan was participating in a discussion here. I was moderating that. And then he said, you see, look at the way the universities are, the academic freedom is being suppressed in the universities. So institutions like IIC should play a role, so that at least we can come and talk freely here. The freedom should be there because they control your pay, your packet, your making you permanent. You go on continuing ad hoc teachers.
The academic community in India, a very large part of it has always been supporters of the establishment, whatever the establishment may be for the time being. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it is this party or that party. So a large part. It's only a small part, yet a significant part, which is able to, dissent from this conformity, this uniformity. Otherwise, I keep on wondering how university courses are being determined. A whole project of instrumentalization of education is taking place, as if education should be given for you becoming an instrument of something or the other, either of the market or the corporate, some technical this, that, and that. That education is a matter of enjoyment, it's a matter of learning, it's a matter of love, ideas. All that seem to be, the liberal vision of education.
It's an end in itself.
It's being seriously assaulted.
Correct.
And yet the academic community does not say anything. Most of it, they accept it, they become part of it. Look at the university. Some of the universities which were denigrated politically, they are still at the top of the same government system, which government has been condemning them as anti-national and citadels of whatever. So ultimately the vibrancy of the intellectual space would depend on the role that the intellectuals themselves play.
And I think there we have been rather unlucky.
Yeah.
In many ways, ideological parties which have a very
Clear ideology.
clear ideology, have always tried to dominate the intellectual space.
Yes.
And use any access they have to power, ensure that dominance. Not that they were innocent.
Yeah.
Only one party was trying to shrink the intellectual space. All parties, when they are in power, try to do so to some extent or other.
Yeah.
Some do it more successfully, some less successfully. And my suspicion is this, that it is intellectual's job to even take a position on that, so that a proper, open, I would say, it's not a debate, open a clash of views can take place in the public sphere.
Yeah.
That's the important
Do
part.
you think? Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add that Robert Putnam, who has been studying NGOs for many years, one time said that the countries, the democratic countries, which have powerful NGO movements and has a huge number of NGOs active, are the ones where democracy functions the best. And the countries which try to control the NGOs or make sure that the NGOs do not enter the political sphere or do not articulate their opinions and views in the public sphere are the ones where democracy happens to be in something of a crisis.
You're talking of a strong civil society.
On civil society, yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Now, there is a comparison which is being done in some ways that so they want you to speak a little louder when you speak. Yeah, no, little louder. Yeah, that's what they're saying. Now, you know what is happening here, the de-intellectualization. That Pratish Nandi has talked about this. That you see, cutting people to size. You know that you say Harvard, hard work. What is this? I mean, it seems so crazy. And then you say that do you think there is a link, a bit like Mao's cultural revolution?
I won't say that because Mao's cultural revolution was much more. These people do not have that capacity. They won on 38% of the vote. With that kind of a support base, beat the police and the investigative agencies of the state, create the aura of a truly dominant party system. They never had the humility to think that you are in a minority, clear minority. 8% vote is 1/3, little more than 1/3. You could have at least a little bit more humble and involve at least some of the parties with which you could work. Some might be too hostile to you, work with you, but at least some. And at least try to have a multiplicity of expertise speaking to you. They want to hear only the voice of those who. That's not a good sign of a. That's not a sign of a attempt to expand the intellectual space accessible to the regime. It's a sign of getting yourself ensconced in a very small perspective on the country as well as what you could do with the country.
No, I was just, if we take it a bit away from this and talk of that incident, in the Kannauр University, and the Kannaur University decided to proscribe Savarkar's a bunch of thought, that Hindutva, who's a Hindu, and Golwalkar's a bunch of thoughts. Now this can go both ways. I mean, if we have a Marxist government, they can ban this kind of a thing. The other way around, these people can do what they did with the Ramayana in Delhi University. So, this is curbing dissent, curbing freedom, and I mean, postgraduates are ready to think about
Curbing also plurality. In this case, one should know what Golwalkar thought, what Savarkar thought.
Yes.
And the students and the researchers should be free to agree or disagree or analyze them or whatever. But to stop people from knowing and learning serious assault on intellect itself. After all, the space for ideas has to be a plural space. There are all kinds of ideas. We don't say, can you throw out these hoodlums whom we don't agree with. We do
What? Actually, they do not even know India. Those who try to contain the intellectual space and redefine it to include only a few of technological schools, that India always had a tradition in which the Purva Paksha was as important as the Uttar Paksha.
And you are not allowed to do Uttar Paksh unless you have done Purva Paksh. And your intellectual and moral integrity was tested by how faithfully you summarize the views of others who have come before you in the Purva Paksh.
And not only tastefully, how powerfully.
Yeah.
And you see, if you give the most powerful interpretation
Yes.
of, say, for instance, Sankhya,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and then somebody replies to it from the point of view of Buddhism, then that is a more respectable thing than giving setting up a straw person and of Vedanta, straw version, simple and crude version of Vedanta, and then demolishing it. No? And I have heard of Pandits who have been trying, and let me give you one specific instance which I heard from Arindam Chakravarti. He told me that one of his teachers wanted to write a defense of Vedanta. So he thought he will write on Vedanta, but he started with something else. He said that he was going to one by one take up 4 or 5 things, Nyaya, and then Buddhism, and Tantra, and so forth, and then give the reply. So when he met him after 5 years, he had just finished one of them, to the second one, and started it. And when he went next time to Calcutta, he found that that man has died. He couldn't even start the Uttar Paksha. He has given the 2 books, giving an excellent interpretation of 2 systems. So that's a kind of, I would say, ethics, as well as intellectual honesty.
No, but there is, I think, a serious erosion in the minds of the people of even the intellectual traditions of India. Forget about anything else, because everything you are doing in the name of Indian tradition. Now, the Indian tradition consists of several. One of them would be the intellectual component. And the intellectual component is so rich and so full of contradictions, so full of dissent and debates, that you cannot just put it into one kind and say this is Indian tradition. This is not true. And I'm reminded, Mukund last pointed out that in 10th century, there was a Darbhanga Navyanayayik. He was Udayanacharya. He wanted to deviate the Kashmir Nyaya tradition. So while he argued Purva Paksh, Uttar Paksh, one of these things that he said was, Te Prachina Vayam Adhunika. And he used the word Adhunik exactly in the sense in which we use it today, a modern, saying they are ancient, we are modern. And 100 years later, there was another, some Gangesh Chattopadhyay or whatever. Navyanayaka. He repudiated Udayanacharya. And therefore, Mukund Lahat says he was a postmodern. Now, there are therefore ways of looking at our own intellectual tradition a little more critically, a little more rigorously, and to find that we have never shied away from debate, questioning, interrogation, from disagreement. we accommodated all that. This was part of the, I mean, it's just as Hindutva has very little to do with the Hindu religious ethos and heritage. So this notion that there is a tradition that you know of, I don't think they are ignorant and arrogantly ignorant and sort of self-satisfied with that ignorance. In fact, one of the things that is happening is ignorance is being promoted. This is a very unusual time where lack of knowledge and
Is rewarded.
is rewarded. I mean, the Prime Minister goes to Maghar, Kabir's place where Kabir is both buried and cremated. And there are one samadhi and one qabr. And he said, while that this was the place where Kabir used to have a dialogue with Guru Gorakhnath and Guru Nanak. Now, one was 200 years before Kabir and the other was 200 years after Kabir. I mean, so you see, you are uplifting,
Absolutely.
and then the arrogance of it. I mean, and this goes all along the line. So what is happening is one of the threats to intellect in our times is the threat of eulogizing ignorance.
To feel more comfortable with that.
Yeah, because you don't know.
No, and then you put a, you have a education minister the first time. Virtually, even go to a university. You see, and he or she is presiding over vice chancellors of all the universities who are putting so much effort and sounds, it's a kind of a trivialization, you see, of education. I mean, I would go to that extent.
There was a time. One of the important figures. Narasimha Rao himself was once on a time, then Arjun Singh was there.
Maulana Azad at the
Maulana Azad, and then Nurul Hasan, and people like that, Humayun Kabir, etc. And people who had some intellectual standing, let's put it this way. Now this has been given a go by, and well, so there is, you see, one of the classical battles. I think this is a classic battle between, in all times, between ignorance and knowledge. Today, ignorance has the support of the state, and knowledge has to seek support elsewhere. And this is where the role of the intellectuals comes in, because knowledge needs the support of the intellect rather than the state. And therefore, in a certain way, there is a battle between the state and the intellect.
That is light on one side and darkness on the other.
So,
It is a battle between light and dark.
the point is, once you want to dramatize by creating these
Symbolism.
binaries, this is one way of dramatizing the crisis in which intellect is and the crisis which the state is in. I mean, apart from glorification of the state is in deep crisis, because here is a state which is trying to build itself and to sort of perpetuate itself on ignorance rather than on intellect. Use of technology is not necessarily a manifestation of your intellectual strength.
Absolutely.
All kinds of, हमारे भोपाल में, we used to say we had mechanics in Muhammad and Muslim mechanics. They couldn't sign their name, but you give them 2-3 things and they will create a cycle out of it. Technology has nothing to do with knowledge. And in our time, technology I mean, one of the other things is that the intellectual must be very concerned with is the excessive use of technology to spread lies, hatred, etc. I mean, it is technology which is doing all this, after all. So his notion that technology is neutral,
The panacea.
this is, it is being used for cruelty, for violence, for. I mean, you invite the vice president to a function, and the advertisement in the newspapers has the photograph of the prime minister, who's not even attending that function, and not the photograph of the vice president. I mean, and technology, there has been, I mean, technology's political usage for wholly ignoble purposes has been championed by the BJP. Yeah.
And then you have also now artificial intelligence coming,
Yeah.
which can also be misused. You see,
No, and the
first technology.
you see, look, creating a new digital divide.
Absolutely.
Whole lot of, you see, the ignorant beget ignorant. So there is almost a systematic attempt to create a vast ignorant India somehow by giving them half knowledge, half baked ideas, very narrow ideas, and things of that kind. You have, so you're creating. There are a whole lot of people rurally. How are you going to use this online classes, attend on, get themselves connected with?
One estimate of number of people left out.
Yeah.
Is that it is about nearly 63%. 63% of the people
Yeah.
have been left out. Only 37% have access to the digital media.
There's a very serious thing.
Among students, even examinees. And
No, there have been cases. There was a girl from Lady Shriram College here in Delhi who committed suicide in Hyderabad, because she didn't have a laptop and she was going miserably down in her studies, and the college was not providing, and there was no infrastructure or some kind of a parameter where she could be given. So I mean, look at the way things are, and a brilliant girl, but come on merit totally.
And now recently, civil service examination results have come. Some young women have done well. But the kind of euphoria which is built up around the young student passing and getting into the IAS or one of the civil services. Because when I got into this service, nobody took notice of it. It was, I mean, except my parents, nobody, you know.
It is sometimes related with dowry
I
or
mean,
something.
this again, after all, you have passed an exam. That's about all. I mean, that makes you no better or worse than any other category of people. And there are a lot of people who just don't go in for that. But to create these kinds
A kind of a commodification.
It's a total commodification, and it is being done so enthusiastically by media.
I think the state is also abetting it.
No, of course. It's, I mean, as you said, about the NGOs, the state has been extremely intolerant of the NGOs and making all kinds of rules and
first beginning, began in a time.
Yes.
From the ministers, including the prime minister, on the whole, hostile to them.
And you see, it's like intellectuals being adverse here. This is more or less, a role which is proverbial. If you want to speak truth to power, you have to be adverse here. There have been very few occasions when a state intellectual has sided with power, and in the bargain has not lost his or her prestige as an intellectual. It's very seldom happen. I mean, it happened, for instance, Andre Malraux, great intellectual, but also the culture minister of de Gaulle, and there are some exceptions, but largely that are now you not only you are decimating and sort of not taking into account the political opposition, you're also trying to undermine all kinds of intellectual activities by, again, trying to downgrade the role of NGOs and the university. I mean, I was told by someone that in a school of theatre, in a school of drama, the Minister of Culture was to visit. All the faculty was putting kurtas and dhotis with a tilak on their foreheads. Yeah, the minister.
No, the journalism school I went to, they do that, they cow dung is burnt for purification. I think this is, that is under the Ministry of IND. They do purification. I mean, I don't know where we are. This thing is
sort of what I'm saying. I mean, what we are saying, of course, is that there is all kinds of attempts being made to undermine intellect and knowledge. Small things here and there, there's that tinkle here and there, but the inroads being made into, so that ignorance will become a matter that you can show having won.
That's just not possible. It's not possible. No, I think
It shows
sheer enormity of this country.
no, but I just want to go back a little with your permission. When IIC was started, the 22nd of January 1962. So the same day, if you go back 73 years, 1891, in Alice, a small town in the province of Oristano, the island of Sardinia, in the Mediterranean, you have the birth of Antonio Gramsci. Yes, the Italian Marxist philosopher who wrote on philosophy, wrote on political theory, sociology, history, linguistics, and he was imprisoned by Mussolini, under the fascist regime.
His prison diary.
Yes, absolutely. Prison notebooks.
Yeah.
Now, Gramsci talks a lot about the role of intellectuals in society, and then he talks of the organic intellectual. You don't have to be educated, you see, but you are an organic intellectual. But on the other hand, now what we are seeing is you don't have to be educated, but you remain ignorant fool. You see, so I mean, now the organic intellectual is there everywhere. You could be a waiter in IIC in the lounge. You could be an organic intellectual. So how things can kind of trajectory can move?
Should not ever undermine wisdom of the ordinary people. I mean, they are not intellectuals and they don't ever claim that. A lot of them have kind of wisdom which is very helpful. I tend to think that this 38% vote also indicates wisdom of the ordinary people of India, that they do not agree with the vision of oneness, of this one, this derision or this degradation or denial of plurality and things of that kind, accommodation and openness and all that. So, our problem, and this is the problem of the intellectuals all over the world, there's nothing new here, that the intellectuals and the ordinary, they are divorced. One of the major attempts that I think Gandhi did was to bring them together. And I think we have now moved extreme opposite position than Gandhi. Gandhi believed in the wisdom of the ordinary people. And he brought that wisdom into political arena and made use of it to unite them, to give them. But now we have reached a point where most politics, not merely the ruling politics, does not believe wisdom of the ordinary. Middle classes, which have been the traditional producers of intellect or intellectuals, seem to be the worst allies, at least I think, in the Hindi belt, of lies and hatred and injustice, or what you the middle class.
Most of the middle class in India
Yeah,
are now follow in the sense that middle class money,
yeah,
but not middle class value.
yes, yes, that's true. That's true. That's true.
Whose role they play in society of waiting, that is assessing
Yeah.
on behalf of society, new ideas, new introductions, new discoveries, and so on and so forth. Not only in India, but in the world.
Well, yes,
That role they are no longer playing. And this middle class is basically only interested in remaining in the middle class,
yes,
in making every possible compromise with whoever is in power.
that's true. Therefore, the role of the middle classes, mind you, it's very interesting. If you look at some of the figures, the Hindi belt, astounding. As the literacy goes up, so does communalism and religious bigotry. People who are getting literate and who are getting educated, they are the more communal, more casteist, and hatred mongers and things of that kind. I mean, this is where the middle classes are actually betraying India, to put it.
I would like to agree with that.
Yeah.
The other thing which Gramsci talked of was the subaltern. Somehow that has with this new thing.
Subaltern, as Gramsci put it, was a different subaltern that the subaltern we have. See, our history had first the Dalits and then the OBCs and that kind, and within them there are sort of different, and they don't lump together into one category. They don't vote together either, and just as the Hindus don't vote together, I mean, Muslims don't vote together, so these also don't. And what is happening is now inroads are being made in them in a big way, and it is support of the OBCs or the sections of the OBCs which might be bringing political parties to success. So it is not, at one time it was merely Dalits. Now the Dalit itself has fragmented. And that fragmentation has been brought about by the state by bringing such policies and things of that kind. OBCs should be separately dealt with. Each one then leading the way to create constituencies. I mean, vote banks, things like that. That is going to happen in a big way now. I think so.
Yes, it is true, and many of the old rivalries have dissolved and new diversities have come. And partly because I think this is not that they are working for this kind of a fragmentation, but because by the nature of power itself, because it is very difficult to satisfy the so-called subalterns with a unified policy, a uniform way of, what you might call attempt to buy their votes, and it's not succeeding anymore. I think there is a little bit of, this is probably a journey towards individual decision making, because every small group wants to have its own strongholds where it can get at least some support and have at least a symbolic stronghold. Like, for example, you mentioned the OBCs. Now, OBCs are a huge part of India. I mean, you cannot expect 55% of India, 60% of India to have one unified perspective. It is just not possible then. So, yeah. Even after all the talk about trying to buy the votes or somehow appease the OBCs to vote for you, even after all that attempt, it is split into so many fractions. So many divisions.
Now, if we can talk a little bit about what is the role of a public intellectual? I mean, in this kind of a scenario, what we have today. Ashita?
I personally have the feeling that all intellectuals are public intellectuals.
Correct.
Whether they like it or not. An artist might look as if he has nothing to do with being a public intellectual, but his art talks. He might not think that his art talks, but his art does talk independently of the artist. Great artists are those who do not control their art, but their art controls them. The great poets are those who do not control their poetry. Poetry controls them.
No, but we had now an intellectual in the civil service, but he was straitjacketed then. Now he speaks. Now he's a public intellectual. So what do you do with such people?
But even when I, not that I, on humility, even when I was in civil service, I did find some imaginative ways writing
As a poet.
and as a poet and as a literary critic, whatever I thought was proper. And
But you were constrained.
not really. Sometimes, as we started saying, that if you have constraints, you become more imaginative, more innovative.
Absolutely. Yes, that's his basic self.
Yeah.
Even if he wants it, he cannot escape that.
Yeah. No, I'm reminded, Akbar Khan once, the television said, थोड़ी देर तो मैं सरोद बजाता हूँ, फिर सरोद मुझे बजाने लगी.
Exactly what you said.
So beyond a certain point, when I write a poem, I start writing the poem, but sometimes it comes when the poem is writing itself through me. That's all.
So
so this notion of public intellectual, those people who somehow come to social platforms and this, that, and the other are public intellectuals, and those who, for instance, do not come to such public are any the less public intellectuals. All intellectuals, as Ashik said, are public, whether you like it or not. And what you are doing is ultimately addressed to others. You may say, I don't care. I do not keep them in mind. But it so happens that language which you use is a social instrument.
But do you think that brings in some kind amount of accountability to the public?
No, the accountability, you see, has different
connotation.
It is the accountability of an artist will be judged by the kind of art he creates. It's good or bad, inferior or great, etc. He is accountable only through his art, not accountable to something other than that. There might be times, and emergency was one in which many writers and people who took to asserting other than their art, they went out of it. But basically, in a normal situation, and mind you, we are not in a normal situation, we are in a abnormal situation. But ultimately, the responsibility of the artist is to, or a writer, is to create art or to write and hope that he is doing his civic duty.
And it is also a duty to his own self.
Yes.
Or his authenticity.
Yeah. Yes, of course. So whether, many people, we say as if they are the conscience keepers or the conscience of the race. In fact, James Joyce had said he went into the smithy of his soul to forge the uncreated conscience of his race. What is in Portrait of an Artist as a young man? Now, two things are important. One, he went to the smithy of his soul. Said it's his accountability to himself. He went to the smithy of his soul to forge the uncreated conscience of his race. Now, the uncreated conscience is done by you are going into the smithy of the soul. And if you go to the smithy of the soul, bound to be doing things which have public repercussion.
Do you think morality is the compass then? For there is a morality, directing you in some way. Your own morality.
Morality directs everybody. Some people respond to it, some people do not. Some people have set up a different interpretation to his moral duty and abide by that. But if he is not true to his own morality, there will be guilt. However much he might say with bravado that I did what I had to do, there is a sense of guilt. I can give you many examples of that.
So in other words, there is a organic moral sense that every human being has.
There's a lovely story which we may as well, now that we're nearing the end, it can be a very good example of what we are discussing. My late friend Udayan Patel was a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. And one day, while on the sea beach, he was sitting there just relaxing. He heard a small group of people discussing among themselves what they did during the riots in Bombay. And he was interested in this. So he said, can I join you? So Naam Pucha, and this gave a name. He was seeing a Hindu, and they were happy that a doctor has joined them. So this man, one of the men was talking and said that they had looted a Muslim shop. And he was referring to the shop owner as a Ravan, a huge fellow. And he had killed him by knifing him. And then looted the shop. And then gone home and had dinner and so on and so forth. He was saying the whole thing very proudly. And he heard everything very quietly and so on. So while leaving them, when they were discussing, he gave his card. We were asking him, Dr. Kaka, where do you see it and all that. And 6 months after the thing, even or nearly 6 months after, one day when he was about to close his clinic and go home, he comes out of it and sees a man sitting there, the one who killed the Ravan. He said, can I do for you? He says, Dr. Saab, I have a problem. You know, I talked to you over that Ravan there who killed. Now, I cannot sleep at night and I've lost my appetite because that Ravan enters my body to my toenails, takes over me, and I lose my sleep, I lose my peace of mind, I lose my appetite. He didn't say anything, but he said, you come and meet me, or we will talk about this. We put him in kind of indirectly in therapy without mentioning the word therapy. Now, this is the kind of sense of guilt. Even that man who was so proud of his deed, proud of his violence. And this is the person who do many of the killings in Gujarat riots is now in jail, actually in mental asylum. First he was in jail, now in the mental asylum because he has mental illness.
Being traumatized by what he did.
What it is, yes. So there is this part of the story. I have not, we in our sample, after so many years, we were doing the study 50 years after it we started. So by the time we ended, it was always 55, 60 years. 60 years.
You're talking of the partition?
Partition.
Yeah.
So most of the people have died. So, but still we managed to get about probably altogether 10 to 15 killers. But only you could be sure about 7 or 8, or maybe 10, little bit more, 9 or 10. And we, except for one case, we did not meet one happy killer. Some of the survivors were happier than the killers.
But coming to that, I think probably we close at that. You see, this there's some move now to talk of partition again. Raise that kind of phobia which was there at that time at the party. Why do we need to do that?
That's a different question because that was the electoral ploy. Particularly in Bengal, they thought that it has not been adequately exploited politically. Punjab has been exploited politically, and because Punjab has had so many horror stories and so on and so forth. So many gifted writers wrote
No, I was thinking of politics of forgetfulness.
Yes.
And unforgetting.
No, forgetting is not possible. You think you have forgotten. The more you try to forget, the less you forget. That's part of human nature also.
Yes.
But they tried to use this in the Bengal election, the recent one, and it did not work because, frankly speaking, it wasn't as cruel and as pathological as the Punjab police. And there also, Punjab, I didn't find a single happy killer. Only one person I found, and he was a Sikh. Sikh. He had, as opposed to the Jathas, which came to loot the Hindus, kill the Hindus, he had set up a Jatha to fight them. It's all resistance. It's like a warfare. And when somebody, Uncle V, somebody, and when we asked him, you must be very angry. No, I trusted my Muslim friends more than my Hindu friends. But that time they were attacking us, so we had to defend ourselves. So that idea, there is was almost like a war. He was talking like a retired soldier. So that is a slightly different connotation. So he's the only one we found who was at peace with himself. That was an exception.
What I meant was that why raise that trauma again? I mean, I understand. But why should the
Because
state?
the trauma has never been resolved. We have not raised it early enough, and it has acquired a pathological form, and it's now the communities are affected by it because you're not confronted this. And even in the case of parents telling to the kids their experiences, the emphasis has been on the trauma part of it. Also, there is also the other part of the story that almost all the, more than 95%, I would say, of the respondents said that their best days were when for that. This was a sudden thing. This partition and the killings.
We were at peace with each other.
Peace with each other. We did. That also was a part of the story. So, but that part of the story often were understated. That was seen as a kind of a nostalgia by the younger generation because they had got the crueler part. But that seemed more dramatic. That seemed more dramatic, more adventurous, and so on and so forth. They have been wronged. This feeling of there.
No, but I mean, coming to a kind of a agreement with the past and looking at the future, how do you go about it then? This kind of a scenario.
By remembering the trauma and working through it. By not by forgetting the trauma. You cannot do that, even if you try. Because it is a part of your personality. But you can learn how to cope with it. You can knowing fully well because there were many people did remember that and they didn't go to psychiatrists or psychoanalysts or psychologists, but they worked it out themselves by saying because they also saw that the other side also was doing the same thing only a few hundred miles away. That was a saving grace.
So they, in other words, intellectualized happenings.
Not intellectual. This was a kind of a they call it is a kind of a moral universe collapsing. That's what they said. That was the thing. I mean, we found out, for example, just to give one instance, that in Punjab there were instances when the Hindu lower castes joined the Muslims to attack the Sikh because it's very prosperous and had a lot of land and so on and so forth. Prosperous. Nobody talks about this. Only one person, the person who is in peace with himself, he told us that they were. So it was not even a purely Hindu-Muslim thing because loot was a very important thing. And there is one story of Sardar Manto where the person goes to Lahore to be a looter. That's his life ambition. He wants to change his life chances, improve his life chances.
But that always happens, when Gandhi is killed. So some Brahmin houses in Maharashtra are burned down.
Yes, I know.
And that is because they had the pattas. It was an economic kind of reason because the pattas had to be burned, so the houses were attacked. It had nothing to do more than place or anything.
That's right. Nearly 100 villages are affected by this. People do not know much about this.
This is not talked about.
Not talked about.
So coming to our intellectual space, I would say that one of the jobs of the intellectual space is both remembrance and reconciliation.
Yes. How do you handle it?
How do you handle it? Because after all, intellectual space is the space in which will always work against forgetting. Powers that be want us to forget many things.
No, but they want selective remembrance also, which is very dangerous.
Yes.
You forget certain things and remember.
In fact, they want to forget many things, and among them, all these things. So the job of the intellectual will be to remember, but also to reconcile. And
No, I think the job, more important, to put it in one word, would be to bring peace. Peace environmentally, even peace between people. I mean, across borders.
Do not forget one important part of the story. Killers as well as the victim during partition violence were both ordinary citizens.
yes,
They were not killers, they were not looters. They changed. Very difficult for them to reconcile with themselves about what they have done. And that is why there is also great potentiality for what we call reconciliation. But that reconciliation has to come only through a more determined effort to understand that why people broke into that kind of a violence. I mean, it was a collapse of a moral universe. I can't figure. One woman told us that her husband, a kind of alcoholic, he took advantage of the riots to throw two of his children from terrace, killed them himself. So they were wanting to run and didn't want to have children probably with him. And said that the Muslims killed him.
No, but even the Sikh riots in 84, and the Gujarat riots of 2002. I mean, we are carrying this baggage with us. You see, there are other. I mean, we had those Delhi riots here recently. So this baggage. I mean, do you think we have to learn something? I mean, they've not been so successful. Some South Africa, they had this terrible.
Very nicely done.
truth and reconciliation.
Yes.
Truth and reconciliation.
That's right.
Sponsored.
That's right.
State
And
sponsored.
the power of it was this, that Archbishop Tutu, he emphasized the thing, the argument,
He is a moral authority.
that in the Zulu worldview, this is the way we should go about it.
Correct.
So we don't care for crime and punishment model of
Which is Western.
inherited from Western. It's Jew. And that won the hearts of the people, including the killers. So they enacted what they had done somewhere. It's humiliation because done in television. Their own family couldn't see
It is a kind of
how
a
they tortured the president.
catharsis in the drawing rooms. Like carrying it right in.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That catharsis is waiting to be enacted in the case of.
So I think on that note, the catharsis is waiting to be enacted. We'll close this session. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting evening together. Thank you.
Thank you.